Hello, my name is Cherie, and today we're reading James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl, and I believe we're starting on chapter 9. Hungry and trembling, James stood alone out in the open, wondering what to do. The night was all around him now, and high overhead a wild moon was riding in the sky. There was not a sound, not a movement anywhere. Most people, especially the small children, are often quite scared of being out of doors alone in the moonlight. Everything is so deadly quiet, and the shadows are so long and black, and they keep turning into strange shapes that seem to move as you look at them. And at the slightest snap of a twig, it makes you jump. James felt exactly that way now. He stared straight ahead with large, frightened eyes, hardly daring to breathe. Not far away in the middle of the garden, he could see the giant peach towering over everything else. Surely it was even bigger tonight than ever before, and what a dazzling sight it was. The moonlight was shining and glinting on its great curved sides, turning them into crystals and silver. It looked like a tremendous silver ball lying in the grass, silent, mysterious, and wonderful. Then all at once, little shivers of excitement started running over the skin on James' back. Something else, he told himself. Something stranger than ever this time is about to happen to me again. He was sure of it. He could feel it coming. He looked around him, wondering what on earth it was going to be. The garden lay soft and silver in the moonlight. The grass was wet with dew, and a million dewdrops were sparkling and twinkling like diamonds around his feet. And now suddenly, the whole place, the whole garden seemed alive with magic. Almost without knowing what he was doing, as though drawn by some powerful magnet, James Henry Trotter started walking slowly towards the giant peach. He climbed over the fence that surrounded it and stood directly beneath it, staring up at its great bulging sides. He put one hand on it and touched it gently with the tip of one finger. It felt soft and warm and slightly furry, like the skin of a baby mouse. He moved a step closer and rubbed his cheek lightly against the soft skin. Then suddenly, while he was doing this, he happened to notice that right beside him and below him, close to the ground, there was a hole in the side of the peach. Chapter 10. It was quite a large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. It isn't just a hole, he thought exactly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was a curious bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees, the walls were wet and sticky, and the peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight towards the very center of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds, he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The fresh peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelously refreshing. He crawled on for a few more yards, and then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up, and there, in front of him, was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It gently felt like wood, except that it was very jaggedy and full of deep grooves. "Oh, good heavens," he said. "I know what this is. I've come to the stone of the peach." Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the stone peach, or the peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up to see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look who's here." And another voice said, "We've been waiting for you." James stopped and stared at the speakers. His face was white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much that he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back to the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared, and there was now only a solid brown wall behind him. James's large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures were sitting on chairs, others reclined on sofas, and all were watching him intently. Creatures? Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog. You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper, as large as a large dog, sitting on a stool directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper, there was an enormous spider. And next to the spider, there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. And each of these 3 was squatting upon a big, magnificent chair. On the sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in a curled-up position, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor, over to the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm. But it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying any attention to it. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in a strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceilings, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced suddenly, staring hard at James. "I'm famished," the old green grasshopper said. "So am I," the ladybug cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. "Everybody's famished," she said. "We need food." 4 pairs of round black glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wiggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran her long black tongue delicately over her lips. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James had backed against the wall so far, shivering with fright and too much terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" the old green grasshopper asked. "You look positively ill." "He looks as though he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing," the ladybug cried. "I do believe he thinks it's him that we're wanting to eat." There was a roar of laughter from all sides of the room. Oh dear," they said. "What an awful thought. You mustn't be frightened," the ladybug said kindly. "We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now. Didn't you know that? You're one of the crew. We're all in the same boat." "We've been waiting all day long," the old grasshopper said. "We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm so glad you made it." "So cheer up, my boy, cheer up," the centipede said. "And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand off with these boots. It takes me hours to get them all on by myself." Chapter 12. James decided that this was certainly not a time to be disagreeable. So he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. "Thank you very much," the centipede said. "You are very kind." "You have a lot of boots," James murmured. "I have a lot of legs," the centipede answered proudly, "and a lot of feet. 100 to be exact." "There he goes again," the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. "He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word. And anyways, there's nothing marvelous, as you know, centipede, about having lots of legs." "Poor fellow," the centipede said, whispering to James's ear. "He's blind. He can't see how splendid I look." "In my opinion," the earthworm said, "the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all and be able to walk just the same." "You call that walking?" cried the centipede. "You're a slitherer. That's all you are. You just slither along." "I glide," said the earthworm primly. "You're a slimy beast," cried the centipede. "I am not a slimy beast," said the earthworm. "I am useful, and I'm a much-loved creature. Ask any gardener you know. And as for you—" "I'm a pest," the centipede announced, grinning broadly, and he looked around the room for approval. "He's so proud of that," the ladybug said, smiling at James, "though for the life of me I can't understand why." "I'm the only pest in this room," cried the centipede, still grinning, "unless you count count old green grasshoppers over there. He is long past it now. He is too old to be a pest any more. The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. "Young fellow," he said, speaking in a deep, low, scornful voice, "I have never been a pest in my life. I am a musician." "Hear, hear," said the ladybug. "James," the centipede said. "Your name is James, isn't it?" Yes." "Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous, colossal centipede as me?" "Oh, I certainly haven't," answered James. "How on earth did you get like that?" "Very peculiar," said the centipede. "Very, very peculiar indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden under the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came whirling past my nose. Bright green it was, and extraordinarily beautiful, and it looked like some kind of tiny stone or crystal." "But I know what that is," cried James. "It happened to me too," said the ladybug. "And me," said the spider. "Suddenly there were little green things everywhere. The soil was full of them." "Actually, I swallowed one," the earthworm declared. "So did I," said the ladybug. "I swallowed 3," the centipede cried. "But who's telling the story anyways? Now don't interrupt." "Okay. I refuse to sleep in my boots," the centipede cried. "How many more are there to come off, James?" I think I've done about 20 so far," James told him. "That leaves 80 to go," the centipede said. 22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. "He's lying again." The centipede roared with laughter. "Stop pulling the earthworm's leg," the ladybug said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. "Pulling his leg, ha ha!" he cried, giggling with glee and pointing to the earthworm. "Which leg am I pulling? Can you tell me that, ha?" James decided that he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal, but what a change it was to hear somebody laughing again. He had never heard Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing out loud in all the time he'd been with them. "He really must get some sleep," the old green grasshopper said. "We've got a tough day ahead of us tomorrow. So, would you be kind enough, Miss Spider, to make beds?" Chapter 13. A few minutes later, Miss Spider made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads that was at either end was so actually it looked more like a hammock than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff that it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light. "I do hope you find it comfortable," Miss Spider said to the old green grasshopper. "I made it as soft and silky as I possibly could. I spun it with gossamer. That's much better quality thread than the one I use for my own web." "Thank you so much, my dear," the old green grasshopper said, climbing into the hammock. "All this is just what I needed. Good night, everybody. Good night." Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock, and the ladybug got in. After that, she spun a long one for the centipede and an even longer one for the earthworm. "How do you like your bed?" she said to James when it came to his turn. "Hard or soft?" "I like it soft, thank you very much," James answered. "For goodness sake, stop staring in the room and get on with my boots," the centipede said. "You and I are never going to get to sleep at this rate. And kindly line them up neatly in pairs as you take them off. Don't just throw them over your shoulder." James worked away frantically on the centipede's boots. Each one had laces that had to be untied and loosened before it could be pulled off, and to make matters worse, all the laces were tied up in the most complicated knots that had to be unpicked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours, and by the time James had pulled off the last boots, all of them had lined up in a row on the floor, 21 pairs altogether. The centipede was fast asleep. "Wake up, centipede," James whispered, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. "It's time for bed." "Thank you, my dear child," the centipede said, opening his eyes. Then he got down from his sofa and ambled across the room and crawled into his hammock. James got into his own hammock. Oh, how soft and comfortable it was compared to his hard, bare boards that his aunt had always made him sleep on at home. "Lights out," said the centipede drowsily. Nothing happened. "Turn out the lights," he called, raising his voice. Jane glanced around the room, wondering which of the others he might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The old green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose, and the ladybug was making whistling noises through her nose, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at the end of his hammock, wheezing and blowing through the open mouth. As for Miss Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across the room, and James could see her crouching right in the center of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. "I said turn out the lights," shouted the centipede. "Are you talking to me?" James asked him. "Of course. I'm not talking to you," the centipede answered. "That crazy glowworm has gone to sleep with the light on." For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up at the ceiling, and there he saw an extraordinary sight. Something that looked like a giant fly without wings. It was at least 3 feet long, and standing upside down on 6 legs in the middle of the ceiling, and the tall end of its creature seemed to be literally on fire. A brilliant greenish light, as bright as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out of its tail and lighting up the whole room. "Oh, is that a glowworm?" asked Jane, staring at the light. "It doesn't look like a glowworm of any sort to me." "Of course it's a glowworm," the centipede answered. "At least that's what she calls herself. Although actually you're quite right, she isn't really a worm at all. Glowing worms are never worms. They're simply lady fireflies without wings." "Wake up, you lazy beast!" But the glowworm didn't stir, so the centipede reached out of his hammock and picked up one of his boots from the floor. "Put out that wretched light," he shouted before hurling the boot up the ceiling. The glowworm slowly opened one eye and stared at the centipede. "Well, there's no need to be rude," she said. "All in good time." Come on," shouted the centipede, "or I'll put it out for you." "Oh, hello, James," the glowworm said, looking down and giving James a little wave and a smile. "I didn't see you come in. Welcome, my dear boy, welcome, and good night." Then click, and out went the light. James Henry Trotter lay there in the darkness with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleepy noises that the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they weren't really terrible at all. They seemed to be extremely kind and helpful in spite of all the shouting and arguing that went on between them. "Good night, lady. Good night, old green grasshopper," he whispered. "Good night, ladybug. Good night, Miss Spider." But before he could get through them all, he had fallen fast asleep. So that's the end of chapter 13. We'll start off with chapter 14 next time. Goodbye.